It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces and some new faces as well. Thank you all for making it out here on a weekday. I know it's difficult and there was a lot of traffic, so thank you for making the time for this. This is really a huge honor for me to be in conversation with Nora about this book. As I was reading the book, I felt very emotional at a lot of stages. It's a timely book. It's very important, especially in this American context that we live in for young adults, not only for Palestinians, but also for non-Palestinian children and others, especially young adults that are going through phases of questioning their identity, their belonging, a lot of coming of age stuff that's important at that age. I want to thank Nora for trusting me to have this conversation. It's really such an amazing honor to be doing this, and I have huge admiration for you, Nora, and I want to thank you for writing this book. I'd like to also thank NAAWA for trusting me to lead this conversation. So, Nora, I would love to start with the first question. If you can summarize for those of us in the room that haven't read the book yet, what the book is all about.
Sure. Ida in the Middle is about an 8th grade Palestinian American girl who is ridiculed and stereotyped at school and just really wants to be invisible and fly under the radar, which I think is an experience and a feeling that many 8th graders have in the United States and probably elsewhere. But for Ida, it's both a matter of her age and of being Palestinian in a U.S. school. Although she wants to be invisible, she ends up moving to a new school and being given the assignment of an 8th grade capstone project where she has to talk about her life's passion in front of the whole school. She's mortified. Worst situation that she could possibly imagine. And so she does what we all do when we're stressed out. She eats. And she's eating from a jar of olives she finds under the kitchen sink, which was sent to her family from her mother's family in their village of origin near Jerusalem. As she eats these olives, something happens. There's a noise, there's a change, and she finds herself in the kitchen, but a different kitchen, with her mother, but now her mother is different and her sisters are different. And over the course of a day or two, she realizes that she's now experiencing the life she would have had if her parents had never left Palestine in the first place. So on the one hand, Ida feels a sense of familiarity and belonging that she never had in the United States. Nobody looks at her funny and they all know how to pronounce her name. So she feels safe. But then she discovers that her home and all the homes in her village are under demolition order. So now she's scared again. When she discovers that the olives are the mechanism that move her from these two realities, she's forced to decide. Which Ida does she want to be? Where does she want to be? Where is home? And most importantly, how can she learn to raise her voice against the injustices in both of her homelands? And that is the young adult book, Ida in the Middle, that I'm here to talk about tonight.
Great. Thank you so much, Nora. And I think, I will just add, obviously you also have 3 daughters in your own life as well. And I have 2 daughters, and they were both born in Palestine, but when we moved to the US, especially for my older daughter when she was 8 years old, it was a very difficult transition for her. My younger one was 3. And she really kept struggling. She struggles until today as well, but she kept struggling with this idea of a new home, right? And so there's this question around, not a question really, but she is Palestinian, she says she's Palestinian, but she also has this new identity and she has to figure out how to exist in this new world that we're in. So there were a lot of parts of this book that resonated with me deeply. And my question to you is, what motivated you to write this book?
To be honest, I wrote the book just to see if I could write a book. My three daughters, even as children, were voracious readers. And for those of you who've been to Jerusalem, you'll understand what a strange sight it was. We would go to the pediatrician's office. My older daughter walked in, and then the middle daughter, and then the little one, and they'd sit down and they'd pull out a book and they'd open the book like this. And the whole room went quiet. Those kids are reading voluntarily.
In English.
And in English. So I really just wanted to see, could I capture their imaginations the way Percy Jackson or Harry Potter could? I wanted to see if I could do it. But once I did it, I was kind of taken to writing as a means of both expression and of activism. And I never studied writing till now. I find it extremely difficult. I have no idea if anything I write is any good, but I'm trying, and I am trying to use writing to further my own activism for Palestinian rights and equality, but also to cleave open space that doesn't exist for Palestinians to do their own advocacy, self-expression, and activism.
Thanks, Nora. So my question, as I was reading the book, or even before I started to read the book, my assumption was that this is a book for young Americans, and this is a bit more of an educational book. Of course, it's a novel, but it's more of an educational book in a context where there is so much misinformation about Palestine. There's such distorted reality about Palestinians' lived experiences. And as I was reading the book, though, I also felt that it was so validating, both of my own experience, even as an adult, that has gone through life in Palestine, but that also came to the U.S. as an undergrad student, a graduate student, and then moved to the U.S. with my children. I felt like it was very validating of my experience. So, who was your audience? Did you have one in your mind when you were writing the book, and why?
So I wrote, Ida in the Middle was my first book. I wrote it when my middle daughter, Jassy, in other words, Jassy in the Middle, was in 6th grade. She's now 23. So it was a long time ago. And so the reason why I wrote it is different than the reason why I published it. It's now my 3rd book. Although I wrote it first, I've published 2 other books since then. And I tried to publish it at the time, but it was before George Floyd, it was before Black Lives Matter, it was before We Need Diverse Books. I couldn't get agents or publishers to read or consider it. And of course they don't tell you why, and you wonder, maybe it's a bad book, or maybe it's Palestine. I think so many of us carry that around almost on a moment-by-moment basis. Is it me, or is it Palestine? And the answer to both those questions is kind of devastating, you know? So when I wrote the book, Ida was in 6th grade, and Jassy was in 6th grade, and a lot of the personality characteristics that Ida has are ones that Jassy has. But when I went to publish the book, my publisher asked me to age her up to the 8th grade. And I immediately realized this was a huge task, because what a 6th grader is feeling and struggling with is really different than what an 8th grader is. What they're studying in school is different. Everything is different. That process happened when I was back in the United States. So I wrote the book Living in Palestine, and that's why I think the Palestine parts are pretty accurate, because I was there, raised my kids there. I saw and experienced everything that's in the book. It's fiction, but it's nonfiction, if you know what I mean. It's from our lives and the lives of the people around us, our neighbors and friends who we love, including Aline, who's sitting right there, who grew up Now, what happened between the first version and the second version is that my youngest daughter came to the United States and had a year of high school at Newton South High School. We live in Newton, Massachusetts. That year was a very bad year for her as a Palestinian. And I started talking to other kids in America and was pretty shocked at what they go through on a daily basis, including at school, not only from kids but from adults. So I was able to incorporate my youngest daughter, May Sand's backstory into the book, and I think that's why I hope it's validating from both sides for the kids in America as well as the kids in Palestine. So yes, my own kids' experiences are in the book, both in Palestine and in the U.S. But it means a lot to me that you related to it and that your kids relate to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of parts in the book just really stand out to me as experiences, you know, especially my older daughter because she's 15. And you're also talking about that age group in the book, has been through a lot of the experiences. And there is one part in the book, actually, at the very beginning, when you talk about how in the U.S. there is this, in schools, in U.S. schools, there's the club system, right? There are clubs at schools and kids can join different clubs, and at a very difficult time in Palestine where violence was increasing and it was a very emotional time for Aida and her family. Aida was looking for a club to join, and there were other clubs in the school that were either, you know, they were basically religious, right? Run by religious groups. There was a club called, what was it? Something in the Holy Land.
Love the Holy Land.
Love the Holy Land. And so that reminded me of Karim's experience because she didn't feel like there is a club that represents her. And she decided to start a Palestinian Solidarity Club, which has been unheard of in the school system, right? And in McLean High School. There were religious clubs. There's a Muslim club, there's a Middle Eastern club, there are other clubs, but there isn't a Palestine club, and I think people are afraid to establish those clubs. So the other part in the book when you address this, you talk about the problem, how it's problematic to refer to the issues that we face in Palestine as a religious conflict, right? And this is very important because it alienates other Palestinians that are not necessarily Muslim, right? But it also shows the conflict in a way that's very distorted. That's not what it's about, right? It's about colonization, it's about apartheid, it's about occupation, it's about people's rights being taken away from them on a daily basis. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that as well, because you refer to it quite extensively throughout the book. Yeah.
So my experience working on Palestinian issues in the United States, and Javier and I were just talking about this today, is that the way things are generally framed by the most powerful interests is as two sides, which implies they're two equal sides, and that they're two equally legitimate sides. And even with that, the way these two sides are represented is problematic. Like if they say Arabs versus Jews, right? Now they've lumped all the Arabs together and they lumped all the Jews together, but it then implies that all of these Arabs are against this religious minority. It's like couched in these terms. Sometimes they say, that they'll say Jewish, they'll say Arab Jewish, something they'll say Middle East. There's so many different ways to do it, but even saying Israeli versus Palestinian, they're all problematic, right? That's the point, they're all problematic. The religious one is particularly upsetting to me because a lot of people believe there's a millennia-long religious conflict there, wherever there is. It's often presented as Muslim, Jewish, but not always. It makes it intractable, and then the person is saying, oh, there's nothing I can do about it because it's been going on for millennia, what can I do? I think that's why it's framed that way. It's framed that way to disable and disempower people from realizing that every single one of us is actually a party, not a disinterested party, actually the funding party to this situation, and that we have a role to play in reducing the harm we're causing and then hopefully contributing to a properly just solution. So I just wanted, I think in the book, to show the reality of how difficult it is for a girl like Ida to raise her voice when the framing that is available is not accurate and not helpful. And I guess that's why I did that.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense, and I think it's very necessary in a book like that, so I really appreciated that aspect of the book. This transitions well into my next question. So there are sensitivities around non-Palestinians writing about Palestine, writing and speaking about Palestine. There are good reasons why, right? Because for so long, our story was not told by us, and only over recent years, we've been forcing ourselves into the conversation, which is beautiful to see. And so my question to you is, as a non-Palestinian, you are married to a Palestinian, you have Palestinian kids, you are Jewish, you're not Zionist. So how do you feel about those sensitivities? I know it's a sensitive question, but I know it comes up, right? So.
I think we should all read books by Palestinians.
That's a good one.
Now, Aviva over there, she's always telling me, but Nora, you have a role to play. And that you have an experience that sometimes even Palestinian Americans haven't had, right? We lived in Palestine together. A lot of Palestinian Americans have never been able to live in Palestine, have never experienced checkpoints, sometimes because they haven't chosen to go because it's painful, but often because they're not allowed to go or because the consequences of going are too great. So I was there. I was privileged. I lived these things. So sometimes people tell me, and also they tell me, I'm not defensive, but they also tell me that unlike some other groups, this is not a full space. There's room for many, 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 many more books that center Palestinian experiences. Hopefully I'm not displacing any other book. I don't believe I am. But I also hope that the way that I'm promoting the book by always speaking with Palestinians is using the book to open up more opportunities for Palestinians to speak for themselves. Yeah. And people should read books by Palestinians.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate that you said that, Nora, because there is not at all enough books for young adults, for children on Palestine that accurately reflects the Palestinian experience and the Palestinian story. So we need many, many, many more books. And I think also, Nora, you mentioned something a bit indirectly, but I will say right out, is that there is a responsibility for people who have been to Palestine, have lived in Palestine, whether they're Palestinian or non-Palestinian, to share that story. It's a very important story, and also I think it's important for people to hear from non-Zionist Jews because they're hearing too often the Zionist story, and that is the one that is so damaging and destructive. So I thank you for writing the book, and also you're de facto Palestinian now. So. And this brings us, to the question around resources, right? There is a whole section on your website that is dedicated to resources because you realize that there isn't enough out there. So if you can talk a little bit about that, and I think this also resonates quite well with NAAWA because we also have on the education outreach program a whole section on resources. Obviously we have resources that aren't addressing just Palestine but beyond, also talking about the Arab world. But if you can talk a little bit about that as well, because I think those educational tools are important for people to know about.
So when I knew the book was coming out, I had the idea that I wanted it. I kind of asked the young people in my life, how do you find out about the books that you want to read? And they said from our teachers. So I'm like, okay, I gotta get to the teachers. And I don't know how, so I started talking to teachers, and going to teachers' events and talking to teachers and writing to teachers and asking to meet with them privately or in groups. I talked to teachers all over the country, Palestinian teachers and non-Palestinian teachers. And I started hearing these themes of either I might teach about Palestine, but I don't know what it is, and I can't teach what I don't know. Or they'd say, I want to teach about Palestine, but there aren't any good materials. Or they'd say, I want to teach about Palestine, but there's no time in the curricula. I'm basically not allowed to do it because I have to do all these other things. Or they'd say, I want to teach about Palestine, but I'm scared. And so I started collecting resources. I put them in a spreadsheet, I organized them, and I embedded that spreadsheet on the website. So under teaching resources, you'll find a spreadsheet with lots of lesson plans and videos and portals, some for the teachers, but there's a lot of things out there. I think the teachers could find stuff to learn for themselves if they wanted to, but there's really not very much for teaching 6th to 9th graders, or even 6th to 12th graders. So then I started trying to fill in some gaps. I put down there what I think is good, I threw away the bad stuff, I put the good stuff in my spreadsheet, and then I started saying, how are we going to fill in the gaps? The first thing I did was I worked with 4 Palestinian teachers, and Aline is one of them, and we did a project analyzing 42 of the 123 children's books involving Palestine that we identified. And from that analysis, we found there's 4 kinds of erasure that are prominent and prevalent in these books. There's erasure through omission, there's erasure through deception, there's erasure through depoliticization, and there's erasure through other kinds of distortion. And we put together a presentation that shows for each kind of erasure an example, a book example, and we presented it at National Council for Teachers of English, and then I presented it at Middle East Studies Association. From that, I was asked to present it to teachers in a professional development sponsored by Georgetown University, and then I was asked to speak about it at Montgomery County Public Schools on Thursday. So 2 days from now, I'll be talking about erasure, talking about IDA, talking about the curriculum that I've developed for this book, which is a 6th to 9th grade curricula, a 6-week curricula, in a public school district that has just passed the IHRA definition, which is the redefinition of anti-Semitism that includes criticism of Israel. I don't know what that's going to be like, but I know that is the front line of this struggle in the United States. And it goes back to what I was talking about, the framing. When they, the bad folks, frame things as 2 sides, they also frame it as a zero-sum game. So anything that is good for Palestinians comes at the expense of Jewish security. Why would I, an anti-racist teacher, take a position? If anything I do for Palestinians is going to come at the expense of Jewish security, I would rather stay out of it. They need to understand that the anti-racist position is not to stay out of it. The anti-racist position is to say that everybody's security depends on the security of everybody else. I know this because I know as a Jew, I am not more secure when you don't have your rights. I am more secure when you have your rights. So my security is wrapped up with everybody else's security and not a contingent upon other people's oppression. How racist is that? How anti-Semitic is that? To say that I, as a Jew, in order to be whole, must oppress another people. That is craziness, and yet that is exactly what we're dealing with in public schools today. That's the front line in the U.S. Of course, the front line in Palestine is somewhere else, but I forgot the question.
The answer
But
is good.
yes, exactly. And we're having fun.
That was exactly the point of the question, that you'd forget the question. I also forgot the question, but I love the answer. No, it's you know, it all resonates very deeply, and especially, I mean, what this last part that you mentioned. My daughter the other day was asked by one of her friends in the class, like, and this is the education that we have to do on a daily basis, right? And I'm like, sometimes I feel sorry that I put my daughters in this position because it's so exhausting. But one of her classmates was asking her, you know, why she didn't watch Wonder Woman. And, you know, my daughter said, well, you know, the actress was, you know, served in the Israeli military. And she said, and that is a problem, why? And her answer was like, you really need to come over and talk to my mom. So, you know, it's just, it's never ending. It's really, it's exhausting, right? It's exhausting for kids, especially, to keep educating their peers, but it's also an opportunity, obviously, to work on that. But there's an institutional problem. And I think what you said around the depoliticization, erasure by depoliticization, is especially important because I feel like we're being asked to do it all the time, right? We're being asked to talk about culture and identity and you know, doing dances and bringing Palestinian food, and then our food is being, you know, appropriated. And so this is a huge problem because our issue is hugely political and our culture is part of our politics. So we cannot really divorce the two. So I appreciate all of this.
I mentioned the project I did with Avia, but I forgot to mention two other projects. One is that two rock star curriculum developers designed this 6-week curriculum for IDA, and it's supposed to be coming out like in 2 days. It's supposed to be up by Thursday. It won't be, but soon after. And that's intended to support teachers who do want to teach and give them the materials. The lessons are designed so that even if they don't teach the book, they have a lesson about Palestinian joy. They have a lesson about home demolition. They have a lesson about the Nakba. That's for 6th to 9th graders. That can be taught either in English or social studies. And the other one is a project I'm doing with a Jewish American author of a YA novel just released. Her name is Alice Rothschild, and her book is called Finding Melody Sullivan. And Alice and I are working on a toolkit for teachers who fear being accused of anti-Semitism. And so we interviewed people very directly. We're like, we're going to do this very directly. What do you advise if a teacher either is accused or fears being accused of anti-Semitism? We got so much rich material, really rich material. We intend to put that together and get that to people, because a lot of the teachers don't even know, unfortunately, or unfortunately, that it's controversial. They don't necessarily know they might get in trouble. So we want to warn them, but we don't want to scare them. We want to say, you need to do this, and not because you're pro-Palestinian, but because you're a teacher and it's your job, you know? And also, when you do it, let's be honest, that there is a movement with organizations and initiatives that are out there trying to attack us when we do this. And so let's be smart about it, and let's do it in solidarity with one another, and let's defend each other when we need to.
Thanks, Nora. So we're going to go into the meat of the book a little bit now. There are a lot of strong women in the book as role models, and that was really exciting for me to read their stories, especially referring to Aida's mom and her aunt. So the interesting part is that in the U.S., when Aida's living in the U.S., her aunt is dead, right? And her backstory, why she was dead, was interesting, and we find that out throughout. And I'm not going to give it away because you need to buy the book and read it yourself. And there's also, when she goes to Palestine, her aunt is alive, and she's a huge influence on Aida, and and just plays a really huge role in the book itself throughout. So I would like for you to talk a little bit about the role of Ida's mom and her aunt in the book, as strong role models.
Did we agree on that question?
Well, I think so.
Now, my editor said that the mother role is very weak, actually. And he kept trying to make her a stronger person, but I think that I thought that was me, and that was really hard for me to make her a stronger person. But it was easy for me to make the aunt a very strong person, because I've got some pretty strong aunts. As my cousin there, Stan, will tell you, we've got some pretty strong aunts, right? I guess I just see strong women everywhere. That's what I see. I look around, I see strong women, and they're in the book. That's the reality that I live in. I couldn't write it any differently.
Thanks, Nora. So there's a part in the book when you talk about loss and exile, and that is the Palestinian story, right? That is the Palestinian experience. We have 50% of Palestinians living in the diaspora. Palestinians in Palestine are experiencing loss on a daily basis. So I'd like to ask you to read on pages it's a bit of a long passage, but pages 118 to 120. There's a discussion that happens that Ida asks her parents a question. So if you can read those, please.
Dad, Ida asked, even before digging into the steaming food on her plate. He mumbled, his mouth full. Why did you guys leave Palestine? Dad nearly choked. Oh, yeah. Should I start again?
Yeah.
Okay, Dad. Dad, Ida asked, even before digging into the steaming food on her plate. He mumbled, his mouth full. Why did you guys leave Palestine? Dad nearly choked. Why are you asking that now? He sounded defensive, as if he'd been accused of a crime. But Ida knew somehow that under his armor of anger, Dad felt shame. Just wondering, I don't know, it must have been hard for you to be away from your family all this time. Ida looked at her parents. She realized her question had hit a nerve, and she tried to soften it. Of course it's hard to be away from them, but you're our family too, Mom spoke up. Do you think it's better for us here, Dad? Danya broke in, surprising everyone. That's her older sister. She wasn't challenging him, and the sincerity of her question seemed to catch Dad off guard. Ida hadn't realized that Danya ever thought about Palestine. Dad looked back and forth from Ida to Danya and then to Mom. Then he hung his head over his hands, clenched on the table. Even Sunwa seemed to be holding her breath, waiting for Dad's answer. We didn't sit down and decide to raise our kids here in the United States, he began. He was looking at Mom as he spoke, as if he needed her support to tell a difficult story. It was the second Intifada, the second time we rose up against the occupation, and the Israeli response was fierce. Palestine wasn't safe, especially for people our age. Mom nodded, encouraging him to continue. When our education was interrupted, the whole family pitched in to send us here to study. Then I got a job teaching phys ed, and we decided to stay for a while so that Danya could learn English while she was small and experience things she wouldn't have the opportunity to do there. As Dad spoke, his head was shaking as if he himself didn't understand why they had stayed so long and couldn't believe he was raising his children outside its homeland. When you were born, Ida, we just stayed. I had a decent job by then, and our families kept telling us that it was too difficult at home. It just gets worse and worse over there. It's not the Palestine we wanted to give you.
Yeah, I think thank you, Nora. I feel like, that last sentence, it's not the Palestine we wanted to give you, is, so, just touches me so deeply, and I relate to it quite strongly. It's always hard, right? Like, when you leave, I think, any country that you are from, probably, like, you take a piece of that with you, like, you never, and I think for Palestinians especially, we never truly, like, leave it behind. We take it with us everywhere. I think for some people, probably more than others. Obviously, I don't want to speak on behalf of others because I know each person experiences exile in a different way, but I know, Nora, you and I talk about this a lot, but basically, I always tell people I've only been in the US for 8 years, and probably in 30 years I'm still going to be saying something like, I've only been in the US for, 30 years? Because it's I feel like also being outside of Palestine, I have this privilege and responsibility to continue to tell the Palestinian story, and I don't take it lightly, but I'm also always questioning, did I do the right thing for my children, who exist differently actually when they're in Palestine. It's very similar to Aida's experience. They exist in a different way when they're there. It's this, there's this community aspect, there's a lot of, there's a lot of good things and bad things, obviously. There are things where it's like, everyone knows and wants to know everything about you all the time, which could be a little too much, but it's also so nurturing and loving. And I feel like they miss that in the US. And then of course there are things that are good about having an education system, having access, being able to travel without checkpoints, not fearing that the daily insecurity that we're exposed to as a result of living under Israeli occupation. But it's always a difficult question to answer.
It's always Palestinians who get on that line, actually, that exact line. I think it really must hit a nerve.
Yeah.
But one thing that's interesting is that my girls, we lived in Palestine for 13 years, so they grew up and they went to school there, and they consider themselves Palestinian. One of them will never live in the United States. She doesn't even like visiting. But whenever they would come here, there were certain things that they loved about coming to the United States. We'd come in the summer and we'd visit my family. And I just wonder if anyone knows the number one thing that my daughters loved about the United States. Just guess.
Donuts.
McDonald's? No. Donuts? That's a good one, but no.
Shopping?
No, it was water pressure.
That's a good one. Okay, last question, and then we'll open it up to questions. There is a part that is actually quite sensitive to me, and that I didn't realize that will touch me in that way. I didn't realize I will come across it in the book, and that's the part when you so transparently talk about the complications of being Palestinian in Jerusalem, in particular. And I'd love to ask you to read the passage on page 165.
This is in a pastry shop
Yes.
in West Jerusalem. See that young woman making coffee behind the counter? Maleka asked. That's Ida's aunt. Ida nodded. She's Palestinian. Ida raised her eyebrows. And see that couple in the corner holding hands? Ida nodded again. They're Palestinian too. They probably came here because it's unlikely that someone they know will see them until they're parents. They could never act that way on our side of town. I don't get it, Ida admitted. You mean the soldiers come to our village and arrest us and demolish our houses, and then we come here and pretend like we don't mind? Oh, we're not that shallow, Malika looked amused. It's complicated. She paused to put her thoughts into words. They have stuff over here on the Jewish side that we want. Pastry shops, malls, books, cinemas. Every person wants nice things. We want to enjoy our lives, right? And don't we deserve nice things as much as they do? Ida nodded. Auntie Malika was really convincing. I come here when I want something we don't have on the Arab side, like the best orthopedic specialist in town. Just because I go to an Israeli doctor and eat Israeli pastries doesn't mean I give them permission to shoot me, does it? I guess not, Ida said, but she still had doubts. You know I went to an Israeli university, Malika continued. I could have gone to one in the West Bank. Birzeit University and the Bethlehem University, they're all very good. But I wanted to be able to work in Israel. Why shouldn't I? It's my country, isn't it? But you were so angry at those guards at the checkpoint. I was angry, and I'm still angry. Not just about rude soldiers, but about our whole situation. They continue to demand to be here, not as equals, but as people with more rights than we have, just because they're Jewish. I'm both angry and sad that it's gone on for so long, and that as hard as we work to change it, it often feels like things only get worse. Isn't that a good reason to stop dealing with them? I mean, if they aren't open to changing or even listening to us, Ida mused. Some of us boycott Israel, just like South Africa was boycotted, and that's putting a lot of pressure on Israel to change. The boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement is one of our strongest nonviolent tools. But in Jerusalem, our situation is different. They took over Jerusalem, so we don't have a choice but to interact with Jewish Israelis all the time. We need to be able to talk to them, know how they think. The Palestinians outside are changing how our story is told, and we're here, holding on to the land, refusing to be erased from history.
Thanks, Nora. I guess just before we go into questions, I wanted to say what I loved about this part is how authentic it was, because it is a struggle, and Israel has forced fragmentation on Palestinians, and with checkpoints, with inability of Palestinians from Jerusalem to go to the West Bank or to Gaza, or even travel in general, and for people from those areas also that live in Gaza and the West Bank to come into Jerusalem. It's a very specific situation that we're in, and we're also, Malaika was talking about how she went to the best orthopedic surgeon. But the fact is, we actually pay into health insurance and we pay taxes, so those are rights that are owed to us. And so, we're always questioning this because the way the Israeli system is set up is that we feel like we are foreigners in our own homeland, we're foreigners in our own city, but it's our city. And we actually don't have choices. We don't have choices to, when I visit now, I consciously do not go to cafes, do not go to malls, because I have another option here in the US, but I cannot be judging my friends and my colleagues and my family for going and buying because they don't have options. So I really appreciate that part because it's a hard one to discuss and to explain to people, and I thought you did it so beautifully. So thank you.